She was just another passenger in faded jeans sitting in row 14. Nobody knew she was a decorated military pilot. When the engine exploded at 37,000 feet and both pilots lost control, 347 lives depended on whether she would stay silent or reveal her secret. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The massive Boeing 777 engines roared to life as Flight 2847 prepared for departure from Singapore's Changi Airport. 347 passengers settled into their seats, expecting nothing more than a routine 13-hour journey to London Heathrow. In row 14, window seat A, sat a woman who looked utterly unremarkable. She wore faded jeans, a plain gray sweater and worn sneakers. Her dark hair was tied back in a simple ponytail. She carried only a small backpack and a paperback novel picked up from the airport bookstore. Sarah Mitchell stared out the window as ground crews completed their final checks. She had deliberately chosen this seat, far enough back to avoid attention but positioned where she could feel the aircraft's movements clearly. The businessman in seat 14B squeezed past her without a glance, already absorbed in his laptop. The elderly woman across the aisle smiled warmly and asked if Sarah was traveling for business or pleasure. "Just heading home," Sarah replied with a polite smile that revealed nothing. She turned back to her window, ending the conversation naturally. The flight attendant, Patricia, walked through doing final safety checks and saw nothing unusual about the passenger in 14A. Just another tired traveler who would probably sleep through most of the flight. What nobody knew was that Sarah Mitchell had once been Captain Sarah Mitchell of the United States Air Force. She held the Distinguished Flying Cross and had flown 217 combat missions. She was one of only 12 women ever selected for the Air Force's most elite aviation program, training pilots to handle aircraft in situations that pushed human capability to its absolute limits. She had flown experimental aircraft that officially didn't exist, conducted operations where one mistake meant instant death, and survived scenarios that had killed pilots with twice her experience. But that life ended 3 years ago. A training accident during a test flight had grounded her permanently, despite her protests that she was still capable. The retirement was generous, the ceremony respectful, but the transition to civilian life felt empty. She tried consulting for aerospace companies, but conference rooms felt like suffocating after years of actually flying. She tried teaching at a flight school, but training weekend pilots in Cessnas felt meaningless after mastering fighter jets. So she traveled aimlessly, carrying her extraordinary skills like invisible baggage that nobody could see and would probably never need. The takeoff was perfect. The engine spooled up smoothly, the aircraft accelerated down the runway, and Singapore fell away beneath them as they climbed toward cruising altitude. Sarah felt the familiar sensations that most passengers never noticed, the slight corrections for crosswind, the reduction to climb power, the gentle bank toward the first waypoint. Everything proceeded exactly as it should. 3 hours into the flight, somewhere over the Bay of Bengal at 37,000 feet, Sarah was dozing when something changed. The engine tone fluctuated slightly, just a momentary hesitation that most people wouldn't notice. But Sarah's eyes snapped open instantly. She listened carefully, filtering out passenger conversations and focusing entirely on the aircraft itself. There was again an irregularity in the port engine, nothing dramatic but definitely not normal. She glanced around the cabin. Nobody else had noticed anything. The businessman beside her remained absorbed in his work, the elderly woman had fallen asleep, and the flight attendants continued their service routine. Sarah told herself she was being paranoid. Commercial aircraft had multiple redundant systems. Even if one engine developed problems, these planes could fly perfectly well on a single engine. She closed her eyes again, trying to relax, but something felt wrong. 20 minutes later, the captain's voice came over the speakers with forced casualness that immediately told Sarah something was actually wrong. "Folks, this is Captain Reynolds from the flight deck. We're experiencing a minor technical issue with one of our engines, nothing to be concerned about, but we'll be descending to a lower altitude and diverting to Kolkata, India. We apologize for the delay, but safety is always our top priority." The announcement triggered predictable reactions. Business travelers checked their watches, parents explained to children why they weren't going to London, and nervous flyers gripped their armrests. Sarah listened to what the captain hadn't said. A minor issue that required diverting 1,500 miles off course wasn't minor at all. The descent to lower altitude suggested they were shutting down the problematic engine. And the captain's voice carried tension that civilians wouldn't recognize but that Sarah heard clearly. The descent began smoothly. Sarah felt the pressure change and watched the wing through her window, noting that flaps remained retracted because they were still at high speed. Flight attendants moved through the cabin collecting trash and securing overhead bins, their professional calm masking any concerns. Then the aircraft shuddered violently. Passengers gasped and grabbed armrests. Children started crying. Even the flight attendants had to brace themselves. Sarah's eyes immediately went to the port wing and her blood ran cold. The engine cowling had partially separated and was flapping in the slipstream, pieces tearing away. Worse, she saw flames licking around the engine core, bright orange fire visible even in daylight, with black smoke streaming behind. The aircraft began banking sharply to the right as the pilots tried to turn away from the damaged engine. But Sarah could feel through the seat that something else was wrong. The aircraft's movements felt sluggish, controls not responding correctly. That meant they were dealing with more than just an engine fire. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up despite the illuminated seatbelt sign. "Miss, you need to sit down and fasten your seatbelt," Patricia said sharply, appearing at Sarah's side with command authority. But Sarah ignored her and stepped into the aisle, moving toward the front of the cabin while scanning the wings and feeling the aircraft's movements. The aircraft shuddered again, harder this time. The nose dropped sharply and passengers screamed. Overhead compartments burst open, spilling bags into the aisle. Flight attendants struggled to reach their jump seats. Sarah grabbed a seat back to steady herself. They had lost hydraulics, probably multiple systems damaged by debris from the disintegrating engine. That meant the pilots were fighting to control 300 tons of aircraft using only limited backup systems that might not be sufficient. She reached the forward galley where two flight attendants were strapping into their jump seats, faces pale but professional. "I need to get to the flight deck," Sarah said with absolute authority. The senior attendant, Michael, shook his head firmly. "That's impossible. The cockpit door is locked per security protocols. Passengers are absolutely forbidden from approaching the flight deck under any circumstances." "I'm a pilot," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the chaos with calm certainty. "United States Air Force, retired. Captain Sarah Mitchell. I have over 5,000 hours commanding military aircraft including emergency situations. Your pilots are dealing with multiple system failures and they need help right now, or everyone on this aircraft is going to die." Michael stared at her in disbelief, trying to process this while the aircraft continued its terrifying descent and alarms sounded from behind the locked door. Regulations were clear, absolutely no unauthorized access to the flight deck. But regulations were written for terrorists, not for situations where expert help might prevent disaster. He grabbed the interphone and told whoever answered that a passenger claimed to be a military pilot and wanted access to the cockpit. Sarah didn't wait for permission. She grabbed the handset from Michael and spoke with command voice that brooked no argument. "Flight deck, this is Captain Sarah Mitchell, United States Air Force, retired, 5,000 hours command time, combat veteran. I can see from back here that you've lost hydraulics and you're about to lose directional control. You can verify my credentials later, but right now you need another set of hands who knows how to handle aircraft when systems are failing, and you need them immediately." 5 seconds of silence felt like eternity while the aircraft shook itself apart. Then the cockpit door lock buzzed and clicked open. Sarah pushed through immediately and stepped into controlled chaos. Captain Reynolds, gray-haired and in his late 50s, was wrestling with the control yoke while sweat poured down his face. His first officer, Davis, was frantically working through emergency checklists while trying to communicate with air traffic control. "Who the hell are you?" Reynolds demanded without taking his eyes off the instruments. "Sarah Mitchell, former Air Force captain, and I'm here to help you fly this thing," Sarah said, immediately scanning the instrument panel. Both hydraulic systems showing zero pressure, primary flight controls degraded to manual reversion, number 1 engine indicating fire and thrust at 0, number 2 engine operating normally but unable to provide sufficient control authority alone. Their altitude was bleeding away at 1,500 feet per minute toward the ocean below. "We can't hold altitude, we're losing pitch control and Kolkata is 200 miles away," Davis reported, voice tight with controlled fear. "ATC is clearing airspace and scrambling emergency services, but there's no way we're making it to the airport." Sarah stepped behind the center console, her eyes moving across instruments with practiced speed. "You're trying to maintain level flight with conventional control inputs, but without hydraulics you don't have enough authority," she said quickly. "You need to use asymmetric thrust and rudder in coordinated pulses to control your pitch attitude. Number 2 engine, advance to maximum continuous thrust, then reduce to idle and repeat every 6 seconds. Use the speed changes to pitch the nose up during thrust increases." Reynolds stared at her like she was insane. That's not in any checklist I've ever seen. That's completely unconventional. It's also what you do when you've flown damaged aircraft with degraded controls and you're out of good options, Sarah shot back. I've done this with aircraft that were basically flying debris. This bird still has one good engine and some control surfaces that work. You can keep trying conventional flying and guarantee you'll crash into the ocean, or you can let me show you how to handle it unconventionally and maybe save everyone aboard. Your choice, Captain, but you need to make it in the next 30 seconds because we're passing through 23,000 feet. Reynolds looked at Davis. Something unspoken passed between them, the acknowledgement that they were out of options and out of time. Show me, Reynolds said. Sarah didn't hesitate. She leaned forward to see the instruments clearly while calling out instructions in clipped, precise language. Right hand to throttle number 2, left hand stays on yoke. Advanced throttle to max continuous thrust now. Reynolds complied and the remaining engine roared to full power. The aircraft accelerated and the nose began to rise slightly. Hold it, now back to idle, quick. Reynolds pulled the throttle back and the nose dropped again but not as far as before. Sarah had successfully demonstrated they could influence pitch attitude using engine power in ways conventional flying never contemplated. Davis, I need you on radio to declare emergency and request immediate military assistance, Sarah continued. Tell them we need fighter intercept for visual assessment of our damage and we need a divert field with maximum runway length and full emergency services. And I need someone calculating our best glide range because we're eventually going to run out of altitude. While Davis worked the radio, Sarah coached Reynolds through the incredibly difficult task of flying the damaged aircraft using techniques she had learned in classified training programs. Pulse the thrust to control pitch. Use the rudder in coordinated jabs to prevent oscillations. Accept that the aircraft wants to descend and work with it instead of fighting it. Bleed off excess speed through gentle turns that use up altitude while maintaining airspeed for control authority. I've got 2 Indian Air Force fighters inbound for visual assessment, Davis reported. And they're vectoring us toward Car Nicobar Island. It's got a military airfield with a 10,000-foot runway about 90 miles from our current position. At our current descent rate we'll be down to 3,000 feet by the time we get there. Sarah did the math instantly. That works if we can stretch our glide range and if we can get the landing gear down without hydraulics. Captain, start a 10-degree right turn using rudder and differential power on my mark. We need to point this bird toward that runway and commit because we won't get a second chance. The next 40 minutes were an endless nightmare of coaxing the dying aircraft across miles of empty ocean while fighting for every foot of altitude and every knot of airspeed. Sarah stood behind Reynolds calling out commands while he executed them with steady hands. Davis worked the radio and emergency checklist. Through the windscreen they watched 2 Indian Air Force MiG-29 fighters circle their crippled airliner, the fighter pilots transmitting damage reports that confirmed what Sarah already knew. The number 1 engine was completely destroyed with significant damage to the wing structure, hydraulic lines severed, flight control cables damaged. It was basically a miracle the aircraft was still flying at all. Approaching the island, runway in sight at 2 o'clock, 15 miles, Davis called out. They were down to 4,000 feet, descending through broken clouds with the island's green jungle and white beaches visible ahead. The runway was clearly marked by emergency vehicles with flashing lights lining both sides. We need gear down, Sarah said. Without hydraulics we'll have to use the alternate extension system. Davis, pull the gear alternate extension handle and give it 30 seconds for gravity deployment. Davis reached overhead and pulled the red handle that mechanically released the landing gear uplocks, allowing the wheels to drop and lock using gravity and springs instead of hydraulic pressure. They felt 3 solid thumps as the wheels locked down, and 3 green lights illuminated indicating the gear was down and locked. Flaps are staying up, we don't have hydraulics to extend them, Reynolds noted, which meant they would be landing at much higher speed than normal, at least 170 knots instead of the usual 140. We'll make it work, Sarah said with confidence. The runway is long enough and they'll have arresting barriers if we can't stop normally. Captain, bring the throttle to idle and let her descend. We want to cross the threshold at 200 feet and 175 knots. I'll call out the corrections. The damaged aircraft descended toward the runway with all the grace of a brick, nothing about the approach matching smooth profiles that commercial pilots practice thousands of times. Sarah kept calling corrections as Reynolds wrestled with controls, using tiny jabs of rudder and asymmetric thrust to keep wings level and nose pointed at the runway centerline. The fighters peeled away to give them space. The ground rushed up, jungle giving way to cleared land giving way to runway threshold. 50 feet on speed, hold what you've got, Sarah called. 30 feet, slight left correction, throttle pulse. Reynolds tapped the throttle and the aircraft straightened. 20 feet, flare now, pull back gently. Reynolds pulled the yoke back and the nose lifted slightly as the main wheels touched concrete with a bang and screech of rubber. Throttle idle, reverse thrust on number 2 maximum. The remaining engine roared in reverse, trying to slow 300 tons with only one engine and no hydraulics for brakes. They rolled down the runway far too fast, eating up concrete despite the reverse thrust and minimal emergency braking. Sarah saw the far end approaching and the arresting barriers deployed across the concrete, nets designed to catch fighter jets. "We're not going to stop in time," Reynolds said, his voice finally breaking. "Yes we will," Sarah said firmly. "Davis, emergency ground spoilers, deploy manually now." Davis pulled another handle and panels on top of the wings popped up, killing lift and adding precious drag. The aircraft shuddered and slowed, 50 knots, 40 knots, 30 knots, and then the nose will hit the arresting barrier and they felt the net grab the landing gear and drag them to a complete stop with a final violent lurch. 4-3 heartbeats, nobody moved. The flight deck was silent except for ticking of cooling metal and distant sirens. Then Reynolds exhaled shakily and turned to look at Sarah with utter disbelief. "I don't know who you are or where you came from, but you just saved 347 lives including mine." Sarah smiled tiredly and put her hand on his shoulder. "Just another passenger in row 14 who happened to know a few things about flying. Now let's get everyone off this aircraft before something else decides to break." The evacuation was chaotic but successful, slides deploying from doors and passengers scrambling down to the tropical tarmac where emergency personnel and military security met them. Sarah helped coordinate from inside, ensuring elderly and children got assistance, making sure nobody was left behind. Patricia grabbed Sarah in a fierce hug at the bottom of the slide and said simply, "Thank you for being on our flight." The aftermath took hours of debriefing with military officials, airline representatives, and aviation investigators who wanted to know everything about the emergency and how they had managed to save the aircraft. Sarah answered patiently, explaining the unconventional techniques and why they had worked when standard procedures would have failed. Captain Reynolds and First Officer Davis made sure everyone knew that without her intervention they would never have made it to the runway, that her expertise had filled the critical gap between their commercial training and the extraordinary demands of flying a catastrophically damaged aircraft. Later, as the sun set over Car Nicobar and passengers began boarding buses to hotels where the airline was arranging accommodations, Sarah found herself standing alone on the tarmac looking back at the broken aircraft. The port wing was scorched and damaged, the engine a blackened ruin. It was remarkable the machine had flown at all in that condition. She thought about fate and chance, about how her decision to book this particular flight had put her in position to use skills she thought she would never need again. She thought about all the training that had seemed wasted when she retired, and how it had saved hundreds of lives today when everything went wrong at the worst possible moment. "Captain Mitchell?" A voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find a young woman in Indian Air Force uniform approaching. "I'm Wing Commander Priya Sharma. I flew one of the interceptors that assessed your damage. Your flying today was exceptional, the kind of skill we train for but rarely see in actual emergencies. I wanted to ask if you'd ever considered coming out of retirement, because someone with your capabilities shouldn't be sitting in row 14 when they could be flying aircraft and teaching others." Sarah smiled at the earnestness in the young pilot's face. Maybe retirement had been premature. Maybe there was still a place in aviation for someone whose skills exceeded conventional training and whose experience could save lives when routine procedures failed. Maybe being extraordinary didn't mean hiding in row 14 pretending to be ordinary. "Let me think about it," Sarah said finally. "But thank you for reminding me that some skills should never be wasted." Over the next hours, as passengers were processed through temporary facilities, Sarah found herself approached again and again by people wanting to thank her. The businessman from 14B shook her hand firmly and told her his company would be alive tomorrow because of her actions today. The elderly woman hugged Sarah and cried, saying she would see her daughter's wedding because Sarah had given her that chance. A young mother with twin toddlers thanked Sarah for ensuring her babies would grow up. A teenage boy asked for her autograph and said he wanted to become a pilot just like her. Each interaction chipped away at the wall Sarah had built around herself during 3 years of aimless retirement. She had convinced herself that her skills didn't matter anymore, that the world had moved on without her. But today had proven that experience and training never become obsolete, that expertise accumulated over thousands of hours remains valuable even when it seems like it will never be needed again. The universe had put her in row 14 of Flight 2847 for a reason, had arranged circumstances so she would be in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment when 347 lives hung in the balance. That evening, Captain Reynolds found Sarah sitting alone near the damaged aircraft. He sat down beside her on the concrete, both of them staring at the scorched engine that had nearly killed everyone aboard. "I've been flying commercially for 32 years, Reynolds said quietly. "I've logged over 20,000 hours commanding aircraft. I've been through every type of emergency training the airlines offer. But nothing in all those years prepared me for what happened today. When that engine disintegrated and we lost hydraulics, I was seconds away from panic because I knew I didn't have the skills to save the airplane." He turned to look at Sarah directly. "You saved us. Not just the passengers but Davis and me too. You knew things about flying damaged aircraft that they don't teach in commercial aviation. Where did you learn to fly like that?" Sarah was quiet before answering. "I learned it by making mistakes that should have killed me but didn't, and by watching good pilots die when they ran out of altitude, airspeed, and ideas all at the same time. The Air Force sent me to schools where they teach you how to keep flying when aircraft are damaged beyond what any normal pilot would consider survivable. They put you in simulators that recreate crashes and teach you to find the one thread of possibility that might lead to survival. And then they send you on missions where you use those skills for real." She gestured at the damaged 777. "What we did today, that asymmetric thrust technique in manual flight control coordination, I learned that flying an F-16 that took battle damage over hostile territory. Half my hydraulics were gone, flight controls were degraded, and I had to nurse that aircraft back to base using techniques that aren't in any official manual because they were developed by pilots who survived situations that killed everyone else." Reynolds nodded slowly. "You should be teaching this. Every commercial pilot should know what you know. The airlines train us well for routine operations and standard emergencies, but they don't train us for edge cases where multiple systems fail simultaneously and conventional procedures don't work." "Maybe that's what I should do," Sarah said thoughtfully. "Maybe instead of drifting around the world pretending to be just another passenger, I should find a way to teach pilots the unconventional skills that make the difference when everything goes wrong." Before Reynolds could respond, several black SUVs bearing Indian government markings arrived. A distinguished man in his 60s emerged and walked directly toward Sarah with confident stride. He extended his hand, his grip firm. "Captain Mitchell, I am Rajesh Kumar, Director of Civil Aviation for the Indian government. I've been receiving reports all afternoon about what happened aboard Flight 2847 and the extraordinary flying that prevented a major disaster. On behalf of the Indian government, I want to formally thank you and request your cooperation with the investigation that will follow." Sarah shook his hand. "Of course, Director Kumar. I'll provide whatever information the investigators need. But Captain Reynolds deserves most of the credit. He executed the flying while I provided guidance. Without his skill under pressure, no amount of expertise would have mattered." Kumar smiled slightly. "The preliminary reports from air traffic control, the fighter pilots who observed your approach, and the black box data all tell the same story. Your intervention transformed certain catastrophe into improbable survival. The techniques you employed were highly unconventional, and I understand they came from military training that most civilian pilots never receive." He paused and glanced at the damaged aircraft. "Captain Mitchell, I've spent the last 2 hours on calls with aviation authorities, airline executives, and military officials from multiple countries, all discussing what happened here today. A consensus is emerging that the aviation industry needs to learn from this incident. Would you be willing to participate in developing new training protocols based on what you did today?" Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the sense that her skills were not just valued but actively needed. "I'd be honored to help, Director Kumar. If my experience can prevent future disasters by teaching pilots how to handle situations beyond their standard training, then maybe everything I went through in the military wasn't wasted." Kumar nodded approvingly. "Excellent. But there's something else I wanted to discuss privately." He gestured for Sarah to walk with him away from the others. "Captain Mitchell, your military record is quite extraordinary," Kumar said quietly. "I made calls to contacts in the United States Defense Department, and while most of your service record is classified, they confirmed that you flew missions in aircraft that pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible. They also said your retirement 3 years ago was viewed by many as a significant loss, that you were one of the most naturally talented pilots your country had produced in a generation." Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "That's generous, but I was medically retired after an incident that review boards felt made me unsuitable for continued service." "I read the report," Kumar said. "A training accident where you pushed an experimental aircraft beyond its tested envelope trying to save the test crew aboard. You succeeded in preventing the crash, but the stress of the maneuvers exceeded medical safety parameters, and flight surgeons determined you had compromised your long-term flight status. The irony is that the same extreme flying that got you grounded is exactly what saved 347 lives today. He stopped and faced her directly. The Indian Air Force operates one of the largest aviation training programs in Asia. We train not just our own pilots but pilots from allied nations who need advanced instruction. We're always looking for exceptional instructors, particularly those with real-world experience handling aircraft under extreme conditions. Would you consider a position training the next generation in advanced emergency procedures and unconventional flying techniques? Sarah stared at him in astonishment. You're offering me a job based on one emergency landing? I'm offering you a job based on a distinguished military career, a skill set that very few pilots possess, and demonstrated ability to teach and guide others under the most extreme pressure imaginable, Kumar corrected. What you did in that cockpit today wasn't just flying, it was teaching. You coached Captain Reynolds through procedures he had never seen before, helped him understand unconventional techniques in real time while a damaged aircraft was falling out of the sky. That's the mark of an exceptional instructor. Sarah felt her mind racing. 3 hours ago she had been just another passenger in row 14, drifting through life with no clear purpose. Now she was being offered a chance to return to aviation in a meaningful role, to use her skills to train pilots who might someday face their own catastrophic emergencies. I'll need some time to think about it, Sarah said carefully. Kumar withdrew a business card. Take all the time you need, Captain. My direct contact information is there. When you're ready to discuss details, call me. But I hope you'll seriously consider this. The aviation world needs people like you, not hidden away in passenger seats but actively engaged in making flying safer for everyone. As Kumar departed, Sarah stood holding the card and feeling the weight of possibility pressing against 3 years of directionless retirement. She thought about the old woman who wanted to see her daughter's wedding, the businessman who had deals to close, the young mother with twins, and all the other passengers whose lives had been saved because she happened to have skills they desperately needed. She thought about Captain Reynolds fighting to control a dying aircraft and finding reserves of capability he didn't know he possessed because someone was there to guide him. The buses were loading for the final time. Sarah climbed aboard and found a seat near the back, watching through the window as the damaged 777 sat illuminated by floodlights, surrounded by investigators who would spend weeks determining exactly what had gone wrong. Tomorrow she would catch a flight to continue her journey, but unlike all her previous aimless travels, this time she knew what she was searching for had finally found her. Unable to sleep that night in the modest hotel room, Sarah got up around midnight and went to the small desk where she had placed the business card she had received. Wing Commander Sharma offering training positions. Director Kumar offering instructor roles. Each represented someone who had recognized value in her skills, who saw past 3 years of retirement to the exceptional pilot she had been and could be again. She picked up her phone and began composing an email to Director Kumar, accepting his offer to help develop new training protocols. Then she sent another email to Wing Commander Sharma, asking for more information about instructor positions. And finally she messaged several former Air Force colleagues she hadn't spoken to in years, telling them what had happened and asking if they knew of opportunities where her skills could be put to use training the next generation. By the time Sarah finally fell asleep as dawn broke over Car Nicobar Island, she had made a decision that felt more right than anything she had done in 3 years. She was done hiding. Done drifting. Done pretending that her skills didn't matter. The woman who had climbed aboard Flight 2847 as just another anonymous passenger in faded jeans was gone. In her place was Captain Sarah Mitchell, ready to step back into aviation not as a pilot flying aircraft but as an instructor training others to survive the impossible. 3 months later, Sarah stood in front of a classroom at a major airlines training facility, facing 40 commercial pilots who had volunteered for an experimental program in advanced emergency procedures. Behind her, a massive simulator facility waited where she would teach them techniques that weren't in any standard manual. Director Kumar sat in the back watching, along with representatives from several airlines and aviation authorities. Sarah looked out at the faces of the pilots, seeing the mixture of skepticism and hope that maybe someone actually knew how to handle situations they had only experienced in nightmares. She thought about the passengers whose lives had been saved because someone with unconventional knowledge had been in the right place at the right time. 3 months ago, Sarah began, I was just another passenger in row 14 of a routine flight from Singapore to London. Nobody knew I was a pilot. Nobody knew I had military training. Nobody knew I had spent years learning how to fly damaged aircraft through impossible situations. And that anonymity almost killed 347 people because I almost didn't step forward. She paused and let the silence stretch. But I did step forward. And what I'm going to teach you over the next 6 weeks is how to think and fly like military pilots when commercial procedures aren't enough. How to use asymmetric thrust to control pitch when hydraulics are gone. How to navigate when instruments fail. How to coordinate during emergencies when radios are damaged. And most importantly, how to stay calm and make critical decisions when you're seconds away from catastrophic failure. She could see she had their complete attention. Everything I'm going to teach you I learned by making mistakes that should have killed me, by watching good pilots die when they ran out of altitude and ideas, and by being pushed beyond what I thought possible. Some of you will think what I'm teaching is crazy, that it violates standard procedures. But I'm standing here because these techniques saved my life and everyone aboard Flight 2847 when nothing else would have worked. As she launched into the first lesson, Sarah Mitchell felt truly at home for the first time in 3 years, no longer hiding in row 14 but standing where her skills could make a difference for pilots who might someday face their own impossible emergencies. The extraordinary woman who had pretended to be ordinary was finally using her capabilities openly, teaching others the unconventional wisdom that could mean the difference between survival and disaster when everything went wrong and there was nobody else to call for help.